Welcome back to Train Signal. This is Elias Kinaser, and you're watching Working with Services and Service Templates. So this is the lesson. This is the culmination of the course as far as I'm concerned, because I'm going to show you some really cool stuff. And you're finally going to get a feel for what it is that we've been doing. What are all these building blocks that we've been putting together? How are we going to use them? How are we going to leverage them? And what does it mean? What is a service, Eli? You've been talking about services and service templates and how those are going to be the focus and it's no longer the virtual machine. What are you talking about exactly? Services are the combination of hardware profiles, guest operating system profiles, application profiles that are layered on top of provisioned virtual machines, storage, and networks. So what have we done so far in this course, right? We've provisioned the network, we've pre-created the network, prepared everything. We've done the same thing with storage. We've created VM templates. We've created hardware profiles, guest operating system profiles, application profiles. Well, now we're going to bring all of those together to provision a service. Now, if it's still not clear, let's bring up a whiteboard so that I can illustrate what a service means and the power of using a service as opposed to a virtual machine. Alright, so traditionally, what we've been doing, and I've been saying this for a while now, is that we've been creating virtual machines, right? And then we would convert these virtual machines into templates. So we end up with a virtual machine template for, I don't know, Windows 2008, and then one for Windows 2008 with SQL Server on it, and another one, Windows 2008 with IIS, right? And so on and so forth. So you end up with virtual machine template sprawl. You have all these virtual machine templates, and then the name becomes complicated because you're adding, Service Pack 1 and Service Pack 2 and Feature Pack, and if there's any particular application, we would install that as well. So, this is one way of doing templates, and then we have another way where we do all of this, and then, for example, we add Citrix, and then you get into another area here where it's XenApp and the version of XenApp, or, for example, Exchange, right? And then you get into the version of Exchange, and so on and so forth. So the templates became not only template sprawl from the number and the amount of templates that we had, but also they became very complicated from an upkeep and management perspective because of all of the things that we were layering inside of that template. It became very difficult and very hard for us to figure out, well, which one am I going to provision that is more ideal? And more often than not, we always reverted back to the gold template and rebuilt everything from scratch just because it either became very complicated, or as time passed by, we weren't sure anymore of what versions were on there, and it was just too complicated to figure out what was going on. We would start from scratch. The idea behind services is that it's going to simplify this entire process. It is going to use generic objects to bring them together to create your ideal deployment. So for example, instead of creating a template that had the SQL Server in it and Citrix or Exchange and all of the components, we're going to start off with a generic virtual machine template that we created in earlier lessons. We're going to layer on top of that a hardware profile, right? This hardware profile, depending on the type of virtual machine that we're deploying. So if we know that the end virtual machine is going to be a Citrix server, and we have a hardware profile for Citrix server, well then we layer the Citrix hardware profile on top of this virtual machine. Similarly, we're going to then layer the guest operating system profile, and depending on what this virtual machine template is going to end up being, again, we have different guest virtual machine profiles. And then finally, we're going to layer an application profile on top of all of this, right? Now, we can also layer a SQL Server profile. So if this virtual machine is going to end up being a database, then you can also layer on top of that, for example, a SQL profile here, which means it will do two things. It's going to go into this virtual machine, it's going to deploy SQL Server, and it's going to generalize SQL Server based on the SQL Server profile that you're deploying to it. Now, there's two ways of doing SQL Server, and there's still the option of doing templates the way you've been doing it. So you either are using the guest or the SQL profile to deploy SQL, or you have a template that has Windows Server 2008, for example, with SQL Server on top of it, that you're using it as the basis for this template before you start layering things on top. Now, if you know that you have a DAC pack that you also want to apply, then you can layer that on top of that as well. So now, at the point of provisioning, you are taking all of these profiles, combining them with this virtual machine, which is already connected to storage. It's already connected to the network, and delivering it out. Now, the aggregate of all of this is a service. Now, the service can be just a single deployment, which is the case here. We're just deploying a single profile of a virtual machine, which happens to be a SQL server, for example. That's one tier of the whole puzzle. The idea of a service, though, is to deploy multiple virtual machines that serve the same purpose. So, for example, if we were doing a typical 3-tier application, and let me clean up the whiteboard here so that I can illustrate this better. If we were doing a typical 3-tier application, which would mean I would need a server to be, let's say, the web server, and I would need a server to be maybe the application server, and then another server to be, I don't know, the database server, right? So for every one of these servers, I have to create the hardware profile, and the guest operating system profile, and the application profile. Now, typically, the web server and the application server will have both of the same types of profiles that are layered on top. The database server is going to have all of those as well, but in addition to those, it's also typically going to have a, for example, SQL server profile and a DAC pack profile as well, so that it can deploy properly. So what is the service? Well, the service is the aggregate of all of these. That's our service here. That once deployed is going to deploy the web server. It's going to apply the proper profiles for it. It's going to deploy the application server, proper profiles, database server, proper profiles as well, and deliver an environment that is consumable, that is usable from a single click. So you see, all of these pieces that we've been putting together during this course finally make sense. Instead of creating a virtual machine and adding all of this stuff in it and then creating a template out of it, let's keep everything generic and create a wrapper, which is the service, which at the time of provisioning, at the time of delivery, puts everything together and delivers the virtual machine. Mind you, you're working off of the same virtual template that you created. It could be just Windows Server 2012 or 2008 with nothing else on it. In the case of a database server, it gets deployed via SQL Server. You can have multiple templates if you choose to do so. Maybe you don't want to deploy SQL Server via template. You can use for the database service here a different virtual machine template that includes SQL Server, which means all you have to do is just customize the SQL Server profile with just the username, instance name, database name, and I'll show you, or we've shown you in earlier lessons how to do that, but you don't specify the media so it doesn't get installed. And then the DAC pack gets applied to that to populate the right databases and the objects within that database. This is what a service means, and I want to give you another type of analogy for services, which relates to the music industry. If I can think of anything that could relate to services, let's break it down as follows. In your music library, you have files. These files are typically, MP3 files. And you have hundreds of those files, right? Thousands of those files. Nothing prevents you from double-clicking on the MP3 file and listening to it. And then you can double-click on another MP3 file and listen to it, and so on and so forth. Every time a song ends, you just double-click on another one. However, for most of us, we create playlists, right? So think of your services as a playlist. That playlist will tell you which song is going to be played first, and that song can be played first depending on ratings, depending on your positioning of that song within the playlist, which song is going to repeat, which song is not. You can have multiple playlists that have, similar files in them. So you can have the same song in multiple playlists, right? So think of the playlist as your service, because it's aggregating all the components that you enjoy listening to in a single location, and it's giving you control over which one plays first based on certain parameters like ratings and other things that you are manually configuring. So while some of you will say, I have templates, why am I doing all of these services things and I'm just used to templates? I will tell you, well, you have MP3 files. Why are you using playlists? Just go through and double click on MP3 file and listen to it. When it's done, go through and double click another one, and so on and so forth. The idea behind private cloud is automation and orchestration and simplification. Instead of getting to a point where you have virtual machine templates sprawl and you can't figure out your virtual machine templates and they're not clean, I'm offering you a way with services to have a generic virtual machine template where you can layer things on top of it and bring things together at the time of provisioning. You guys ready to take a look at how this works? Let's go ahead and log into our virtual machine manager management console. So a few things that I've done in preparation for this lesson, but also in preparation for the exercises that we're going to do in this lesson, the 3-tier service deployment and also the single-tier service deployment that we're going to do. And in order for you to follow along, here are some of the changes that I've made. So under the guest operating system profiles, you'll notice that in the beginning we only had that one generic one, and I've gone ahead and created 3 others. Now, there's very little differences between these 3. I'm just trying to illustrate to you kind of how these things are going to come together and why we're building these different building blocks. Now, in a real-world environment, the web tier, the database tier, and the application tier are going to be significantly different from a guest operating system requirements. In my case here, they're going to be fairly similar. They're not 100% similar, but they're fairly similar. Here's what I've done with the web tier. If you right-click on it, come down here to Properties. Under the guest operating system profile, under roles, I've obviously added the web server role. I've also added the management tools. And under features, I've also added the .NET framework, some background intelligence. So I've made some changes here. Obviously, you can double check your domain, make sure that everything is okay there, and just go through those settings one more time and make sure that everything's cool. One of the other things that I've done from a change perspective, I've added the web ##. This is a variable. Essentially, anything that I deploy from this application, it's going to replace the ## with just 0001 up to 99. So this is what it will name my machine as it's provisioning them. Now you click on cancel. I've done something very similar for database here, except for the database I don't have the web server, so there's very few roles for the web server. You'll find that it's DB ##. And from a roles perspective, you can scroll down. I haven't really installed anything that is very specific to this, but under features, I've done the .NET framework and a few other things. For the app has a few similar roles to web. Again, very similar from a configuration perspective. And then under the roles, I've added, again, some of the web server here and some of the application tools. So it's very similar to what I've done with web. Now, I've also made changes to the hardware profiles. Now, this is important because, again, in a real-world environment, your IIS server isn't going to get the same hardware profile as your SQL server, and your SQL server is probably not going to get the same hardware profile as your application servers. These are going to fluctuate. Some are going to get more RAM, others are going to get more processing power. In our environment, and again for illustration purposes, it's really not going to matter. So all I've done here essentially is I've made copies of the original one we had. Again, I just want to show you how these are going to come together. So if you right click on web here, come down to properties. Under the hardware profile, a few things I want you to check. So the first thing, under the cloud capability, make sure Hyper-V is selected. Then scroll a little bit down here under the virtual DVD, make sure it's set to none. Under the network interface card, make sure you're setting this to the VM network so that it gets connectivity. And to open a bracket here and help you out a little bit, because deploying services is going to be challenging. It's fun, but it's going to be challenging, and it's going to take a lot of trial and error. If you have a lab that's very similar to mine, that you're nesting a lot of virtual machines and you're using ESX and Hyper-V on top of that, well, the Hyper-V virtual machine is going to get connectivity to the outside world, but in order for the nested VM that's running on Hyper-V after you deploy the service to get connectivity so that you can ping from it and to it, you're going to want to enable promiscuous mode to accept. On the actual ESX hypervisor, whether it's VMware Workstation or ESXi, in my case it's ESXi, so the virtual switch where I'm connecting my Hyper-V hosts, make sure that you're setting promiscuous modes under the security to accept. Otherwise, after you deploy some of these services, you'll find that they're going to continuously fail and error out because they can't communicate, even though you'll find that they have a NIC and it looks like it's connected, but if you try to ping from the machine or to the machine, you won't get any kind of connectivity. So make sure that that is available there. Right now we have it set to DHCP. Maybe a little later on we're going to want to set it to static, considering these are servers, but I'm going to keep this for now the way it is. But I just wanted you to pay attention to kind of some of the changes that I've made. Now, I've made this change to all of them. These are simply copies of one another. I've just named them differently. If you want to follow along, this would be a good time to pause the video and name them accordingly. There's one more thing that I want you to double check before we start doing stuff, and that's under VM templates. Now, under VM templates, if you right click the original template and drag down to properties, under the hardware configuration, I want to make sure that you have contains the operating system for this virtual machine checked. This is important so that you're telling the virtual machine that this particular hard drive has an operating system. You can go through and double check that the cloud capacity is connected to Hyper-V. You can just go through and check your NIC is properly connected. You can do all of that, but I essentially wanted you to make sure that, again, that template was ready for some of the stuff that we were doing to it. Now, because we're going to be deploying network load balancing at some point during this exercise, I want to make sure that enable spoofing of MAC addresses is also enabled. So I want to make sure that's selected, and then we're going to go ahead and click on OK. All right, so we have gathered all of the requirements to create a service. We are now ready to create a service. And I'm so excited to show you this interface because I think you're going to find it extremely cool on what this has to offer. So what we're going to do is create our first service template. And to do that, under service templates here, we're just going to right click, create service templates, and would you take a look at this designer interface? That is what I call a cool interface. This is like Visio, right? It allows you to move things around and position them so that you are creating your tiers and you're adding the applications, you're adding all these profiles that are going to come together and deliver this service. Now, I'm going to start you off slow. We're going to start off with something simple, and then we'll build towards that 3-tier environment towards the end here. Now, you have some pre-configured profiles that you can choose from. I'm going to go with blank just to show you what's going on behind the scenes. Now, for this particular one, let's call this one web server, because we're just going to deploy a web server. We're going to go ahead and click on OK. You'll find that it created the service, but it's empty, and now's our chance to drag assets onto the canvas and configure them. So I need something, a starting point. My starting point is going to be Windows Server 2012, the template here. I'm just going to drag it. And this is really cool, isn't it? It's making that connection between the template and the actual service. And if you scroll a little down, you'll find that it's also making the connection to the network here. You have your virtual machine network selected. If you had any other networks, you can select to connect those as well. Now, at this point, though, this is just a template. There is nothing in here to deploy. There's no application. There's no profile. There's nothing. You see this big green cross? We're just going to double click it. And it brings you right away to the application configuration. What are you trying to make this service to be? So for our purposes, let's go ahead and from the drop-down menu here, it should start becoming clearer why we've been building these profiles, these building blocks. Now you'll see how it's going to be easy for us to deploy these services. So from this drop-down menu, I'm essentially going to select the Pet Shop or the Pet Shop Web as an application. It automatically validates the operating system that it's going to deploy it against. Now I want to stop here for a second and talk a little bit. So we are now deploying an application to this template, but this isn't complete. And if you recall, the way we deployed this application is we had to deploy kind of an infrastructure for it, a framework for it, so that it can layer on top. And if you recall, that infrastructure was web deploy. So if you go about deploying the application right now without anything else, just click OK and go through the deployment, it's going to get to a point where it's going to fail. And it's going to fail because there's a component that is a requirement that it's expecting to find on the virtual machine that isn't there. Right now, we are simply telling it to install this application, but we are not providing that framework for this application to function properly. We're creating the roles and the features and everything, but all of these extensions that it needs to function, well, they're not really being applied anywhere. So typically we would want to get out of here and modify the actual application profile so it reflects that and start this process again. But we'll do this in a second for something else, but I want to show you that you have the flexibility if you didn't have that in the actual application profile to make the change here. So for instance, I want to add additional components to this deployment before it happens, right? So I have my application here, that is all good and dandy, right? So this is going to deploy, it's pointing to the right thing, but I need to install the web deploy feature first. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to do that via a script. So I'm going to select essentially to add a script here. And I want this script to be pre-installed. So before it installs the application, I want this script to run. Now, the script executable is going to be simply cmd.exe. That's what it's going to launch. And then I'm going to give it some parameters. Now, my parameters is I want it to run this actual command quietly. So what we're going to do is /q space /c space. And then we are going to have it run a command which is install web deploy.cmd. Now, you're probably asking yourself, Eli, where'd you get this from? So let me show you where this file is located. So if we go to run, and if we go into VMM, into our library share here, you'll find that under the application framework, under web deploy for 64-bit, we have the actual MSI, the actual deployment, but we also have a script that can call that. So that is the script that I'm referencing over here when I am configuring and building that. Now, I've given it the right parameters. We are going to point it to the right package, and that package is available, readily available within my library. So I'm going to go ahead and select it. And then I'm going to give it a run as account. And I would recommend that you increase here the timeout value to at least 1800. You can specify any advanced settings if you wanted to, from a, how it will handle errors and very advanced stuff here. For now, I'm just going to keep this very basic and leave this. What we've done at this point is now we're telling this application, hey, before you actually install this, I want you to install web deploy. And web deploy is the actual framework that's going to allow this application to function properly. Now, if we go ahead and click on OK here, you'll find that it put it into the right place. What we want to do is we want to save and validate and make sure that this deployment is correct. So I'm going to go back to the management console here, and you'll find that my status says OK, which means this service template is now ready for a deployment. Let's look at one more thing. If we double click on it and we go to OS configuration, you'll find that as opposed to what I showed you earlier with the name ##, this one here is just, it has a star, which means it's just going to automatically generate any name and assign it to this virtual machine. Now, the reason for that has to do with how I built the service and the fact that we didn't use any of the hardware templates or any of the guest operating system templates. It's just using all the default ones, which is why you see this star here. But I did this on purpose because I wanted to illustrate that when you have a star, in some cases with Virtual Machine Manager, you have the option of using global variables. Now, in this case, I'm going to do an @machine name which is a global variable which would allow me to later on change the machine name of this virtual machine at the time of deployment, so that it's not automatically assigning it a generic machine name, right? So I showed you how you can, within the guest operating system profile, you can put the name and then ##, which would just augment it with a number. Now I'm showing you if you're deploying a single tier service, you can use a global variable also so that you can replace that name at the time of deployment. This is a manual process because now you have to enter a name, but I kind of wanted to show you both. So let's keep this and go ahead and click on OK. Now that we have the service the way we want it, we are ready to deploy it. So in order to deploy this service, you have to create something called a configuration deployment. You can do this in two ways. You can do this from up here, from within Designer, and you can also do this from the actual console here. If you simply right-click on your service template, you can drag down to where it says Configure Deployment. Let's do it from within the Designer since we're in here. We're going to click on this. It's going to ask you, what would you like to name this? I'm going to name this web server. And then, it's deployed to your cloud. We're going to click on OK. And this brings up another window here, which is kind of the final phase. Any final thoughts before we actually start to deploy this thing? And you'll find that on your left here, you have machine names. So this would be a good time for you to enter the name that you want to give this virtual machine at the time of deployment. Now, once everything is ready, once you've validated and you've gone through everything, and if you have any other global settings, you've double checked all of those, and you're ready to deploy this, you're simply going to come up here and click on Deploy Service. Now, we're not going to deploy this just yet. I want to go through some other exercises before we actually deploy, and this actually takes a long time. But I wanted to show you first a manual way of how to create a small service template deployment. So let's go ahead and exit out of here and click on Delete. Well, now I want to show you a different way of doing things. I want to show you a more advanced way of doing things, and I also want to talk to you a little bit about changing the way you look and think about templates, about VM templates in particular. Again, I made this clear, but I just want to go over it one last time. Our understanding of a VM template is that you're going to install everything on it, you're going to configure it exactly the way you want it, you're going to sysprep it, and that becomes your template. Every time you want to update it, you have to go through that whole shebang all over again. I want to introduce you to this new notion of a VM template, where you're using a generic virtual hard drive, and then you're layering several profiles together to create a template. So if you click on VM templates here, you'll find that we have two templates that are very typical of what we understand as template. These have an operating system on them. This one has SQL Server 2008 R2 Service Pack 1. Very traditional stuff. Now let's go ahead and create a template that is not very traditional, and I'll show you what I mean here. We want to create a template for our web tier deployment. In order to do that, we're going to simply right-click on the VM template, and we're going to click on VM template. This brings up the wizard that should look very familiar to you because we've used this in the past. Now, but we've used this to create a blank virtual machine essentially so that we can install an operating system. This time we're going to use an existing template. So we're going to select the first option and click up here, and we're going to take an existing virtual hard drive. So we can select a template if we wanted to, but I'm going to actually use this particular virtual hard drive as the basis for this template. We're going to click on Next, and then we're going to give it a name. In this case, I'm going to call this the web tier, so that when we're deploying anything to do with web servers, we're actually going to use this particular template. I'm going to click on Next, and this gives me the option now of specifying those profiles. Now, remember a second ago where I didn't have those options? I just kind of dragged and dropped it onto the canvas. Well, now I am, again, creating and building more and more automations into this thing. Now, when it comes to my hardware profile, again, recall at the beginning of this lesson, I told you that we had created some hardware profiles for our web servers. So we're going to select those. Once those are populated, we're going to click on Next. Now comes the turn for the guest operating system. So we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to select web here. You see how it automatically changes the name? We're going to click on Next. Now is the time for the application. So if I select the application here and we drag down to Pet Shop Web, you'll find that I haven't made those changes at the application level. So every time I have to do this, you see how it becomes annoying because I want to put that pre-installation script and I don't have that pre-installation script. So before we continue this, let's actually exit out of here, even though it'll take a little more time, but let's actually fix that application profile. So if we go to the application profile and under web here, let's go ahead and right click on it. Let's go to profiles and let's come down here to application configuration. Let's add a script. And let's go through that process again. Make sure it's pre-install, and I want to do cmd.exe, and I want to give it the parameter of /q/c, and let's do install webdeploy.cmd. And then we're actually going to select that particular package, which in this case is again the 64-bit one. We're going to give it a run as account. And then we're also going to set this to 1800 seconds. And we're going to click on OK. So we've done this for the actual web application. Do you think that there's anything else that would merit this? Anyone? Yeah, I mean, it's really cool if you pause the video and think about this for a second. And I'd be curious if anything strikes you at this point. Again, tweet something to me at eKinaser. I'd be very curious if anything has striken your fancy here. So if anyone said, well, we have a server app v application, and from experience we know that v applications in general need some kind of an agent. Again, that agent is the framework that would allow these applications to run, to function properly, and without them it won't run. Well, then you're absolutely correct. So for the server app v, we also have to make sure that we're doing some pre-installation steps in order to make sure that this application is going to work properly. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to double click on it, and under the application configuration we're also going to add a script, and it's going to be a pre-installation again. It's going to be very similar, so we're going to do a cmd.exe, and we're going to do a /q, except this time we're going to do an install sav.cmd. And if you're asking me where to find that, that's in the exact same path as the install web deploy, but it's in, obviously it's under the sav. You'll find that very easily. And in this case, we're going to browse, and we're going to specify the sav for 64-bit, which is right up here. And then we're going to give this again 1800s from a seconds perspective, and the run as account is also the same account that we've been using. We're going to click on OK. All right, now we're ready. Let's go try this one more time. Under VM templates, let's go ahead and create that template, and we're going to go through this real quick. Here we're just going to select that particular hard drive. We're going to call this web tier. And this brings us to exactly the same steps where we were a little earlier. And now if I select application and we drag down to web here, you'll find that it automatically populates it. You see how automation on the long run, once everything comes together, it saves you a lot of time, and it makes things easy because you're creating repeatable processes here. We're going to click on next. I don't have any kind of a SQL Server configuration, so we're simply going to set this to none. We don't have anything to configure here. We're going to go next, and then we're going to create. This will go about creating the web tier template. Now, remember, we didn't install anything. We didn't configure anything. This is a aggregation of profiles that are creating this template. Now let's do the same thing for the database and for the application tier. We're going to click on browse, and let's select that same hard drive again, that same generic hard drive. We're going to click on next, and this time we are going to call this the app tier. Next, from the profiles, this time we're going to select app. Guest operating system, we're going to do the same thing. Now from the application perspective, we are going to simply add that virtual application. Whoops. Profiles Eli. And we're going to go with version 2. There's the script that we also added a little earlier, so we're all good, ready to go. Click on next. We don't have any kind of a SQL Server configuration that is associated with this application at this point, so I'm just going to click on next again and create. And finally, let's go ahead and create that database application. Now for the database, and I'm sure you figured this out already, we're going to click on browse, and instead of selecting the virtual hard drive this time, we are going to select the template that corresponds to that sysprept Windows Server 2012 SQL Server 2008 R2 Service Pack 1, because we want that baseline essentially. We're going to click on next, and we're going to name this database tier. Click on next. We're going to select the database tier here. From an application perspective, you're probably wondering, well, Eli, you're about to install or add the DAC pack. Well, maybe, maybe not. If I'm creating a template, then I don't want to associate that template with any kind of a specific DAC pack that I might want to apply to certain SQL servers and not to others. So I'm going to leave that step for a later configuration. I don't need it at this point. So I'm going to leave the applications blank and I'm going to click on next. And at this point, from a SQL Server configuration, though, I want to be able to generalize my SQL Server. So I'm going to select the SQL Server profile that we created earlier, which has all of the configurations that we've done. We're going to click on next. And finally, we're going to click on OK or create. Okay, so I've created templates for essentially every one of my tiers. So I'm now ready to, deploy that three-tier service application, right? Well, we are, but we want to add one more thing. So we talked earlier in the course about load balancers. We talked about the fact that you can integrate load balancers within the environment. In this lesson, I want to show you how exactly you can go about creating that load balancer. There's a few extra steps that you need to do. So up here in the fabric, let's go back to the fabric. And under your logical networks, remember that prod static IP pool that we created? If you right click on that and go to properties, what I've done under IP address range here is I've taken, or we need to take, a subset of this range here and make it available for the load balancer. So in this case, let's say I'm going to use 192.168.1, let's say .95 through 192.168.1.99. So these are the IP addresses that we are going to reserve for the load balancer. And in the event that we want to be able to scale out, well, this would allow us to add, more load. It'll take load and be able to scale out the virtual machines that are going to be able to support the service. So that's one place where we have to make the configuration. Once you're ready, we're going to go ahead and click on OK. Now, once that's configured, well, we now have to create. The load balancer already exists, but we have to create a VIP template for it. So let's right click on the VIP template. We're going to click on create. And let's give this a name. So let's do Pet Shop LB. We are going to be looking to virtualize, or we're looking to load balance over port 80. So we're going to go ahead and select that. We're going to click on next here. From the specific providers here, again, if you were using third party, you'd have more options. Right now, I'm just going to use whatever Microsoft is providing for me. So these are the defaults essentially that I'm going to select. We're going to click on next. What are you doing, TCP, UDP, or are you doing both? I know that I'm doing TCP, so I'm going to stick with that. And then you can enable persistence. Persistence is enabled when you want to make sure that every time a user is connecting from the outside, they are routed to the same virtual machine. That could be helpful. It could play to your disadvantage at some point. So it's just a matter of what the application is doing and whether or not there's certain data that you want that user to always connect to. So that's going to depend on you and your environment, but the persistence here ensures that the user is always routed to the same type of virtual machines through the load balancer. Now you can apply this to just the single IP, or you can apply this to the entire network. You have the option again to filter this via the source IP. So let's do this onto the network here, and let's go ahead and click on next. Once that's done, it's going to give you a summary screen. We're going to click on finish. And it's going to go about creating that job, and then you will have that load balancer configured and ready to go. So we've created that VIP template now, so now we can add load balancers inside of our service when we are ready to create it. And let's do that. Let's go back into our library here, and let's spend some more time on creating that three-tier service template. So I want to show you a bunch of things here. There's a lot of different ways of creating the template. I'm trying to show you all of the ways and then let you figure out which one you're going to be comfortable creating. So let's go back under service template and let's right click, create a service template, and let's give this a name. So I don't know, let's call this one Pet Shop 3-tier. You have your release here of new, so this is the first version, first iteration of this service. Again, as you create additional services, you'll want to like do 1.0, 2.0 so that you can easily find the newer version, and if you're using updates or you're going to apply updates, then it'll be easier to figure out. You can certainly start off with a profile. This is a generic profile that will essentially put those tiers together and then allow you to customize them. I'll show you how to work that in a second, but I still want to start from blank. So if we select blank and click on OK, this is our tier here. This is our service essentially. Now we have to add tiers. Well, I showed you how you can drag and drop things to the canvas, but I also want to show you how you can use the add machine tier up here. So if you click on that, you get this very cool wizard that kind of guides you through, well, how do you want to get this started, right? Do you want to use a copy of an existing VM template, or do you want to customize a copy of an existing template? We're not customizing. We've already done all of our customizations. But again, you see how many different places you have of customizing things? There's a lot of different places where you can customize things. I'm a big believer in that. Let's make everything ready. Let's make it perfect, and then let's just put it together. I have everything that I need, so I'm going to start off with the web tier. Assuming the web tier is the first tier in your environment, you need to think about this for a second. If the web tier is the front end, well, that front end must be expecting other resources to be available before it can function properly. So even though the web tier might be your first tier, it might not necessarily be the tier that you want to deploy first. It might be the last tier that you want to deploy because it's expecting everything to be in place for it to communicate and function properly. So if the web tier is expecting an application tier and a database tier, and if the application tier is expecting a database tier, well, then the third tier, which is the database, should be the first to be deployed. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to start off with the database tier here. We're going to click on OK. Click on Next. And over here you have the option of essentially, obviously you're going to give this a name. So let's, from a tier perspective, let's just call this database tier, just to stick to tradition. And then you have the option of saying, well, how do you want to deploy this? Is this going to be the first to deploy? Well, if that's the case, then you would leave this at number 1. And how are you going to service this? When you want to go to update this, is this going to be the machine that's going to get updated first among the different tiers that you're going to have in your environment? I've made the decision after I've designed my environment and figured out how the application works that yes, I want to always deploy the database first, and I also want to update it first. So I'm going to leave these at the default. So you have some other options here that you can play around with and change, but I'm good the way it is right now. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. Here's your summary screen. We're going to go ahead and click on Create. And look at that. It literally puts this onto the canvas for you right away. Well, now let's do another one. Let's go ahead and click on Add Machine Tier again. And let's do this time the application portion. So let's go ahead and click this. And down here we're going to do the app tier. Just click on Next. And we're going to name this app tier. This one goes second in my deployment, and I also want to service it as the second option. So Next and Create. And look at that. It's putting them in order for me. It's customizing them the way they should be customized. It's very, very cool. And finally, we're going to click on Machine Tier one more time. And from the browse here, we're going to select Web. Okay. This one is going to go third. Click on Next. And we're going to click on Create. And voila. Well, now that we have all the tiers on the canvas, let's go ahead and add a network load balancer. And we're going to take the opportunity also to rename this tier as web tier, considering we missed that. So in order to add a load balancer to the mix, it's really very simple. We're just going to simply click on Add Load Balancer up here. And it's going to add all the necessary components. As you'll see, they're scattered all around the screen. So what I want to do is just essentially bring them down here so that I can design them appropriately. And I'm going to put the load balancer right here, right next to my web tier. And let's actually bring the client down here. Let's bring the server connector down here. This should be really nice. Now the only thing I have to do is click on connector here. I want to connect the server component up to the NIC for the server here and the client component up to the VM network. And bada bing, bada boom, that's all it takes to add the network load balancer onto this canvas. However, notice as soon as I click save and validate, we're going to get a bunch of errors, as you can see right here. Now let's go back to the cursor. Now what's essentially happening is you've just added a network load balancer to this profile, to this tier, but this tier is not really ready for network load balancing. There's a lot of other things that you have to do in order to make sure that this is load balancer ready, right? So let's hit save and validate one more time. Now what are the things that you need to do? Well, let's go into the profile here and let me show you this real quick. So if you cancel, as soon as you double click on it, it'll give you all of the errors that it's kind of suffering from so that you can address them. But to summarize them for you, the first thing that you want to do is under hardware, we want to make sure that we configure the NIC for a static IP and a static MAC. Right now it's set to dynamic, so if you set it to static, it's going to get an IP address out of the static IP address pool that we created earlier. Now keep in mind, this should be set to IPv4 because that's the only static IP pool that we have. If we had IPv6, then you can set it to both if you had both of them. In our case, we only have one, so make sure you're setting it to that one only. From a MAC address perspective, you want to set that to static. Also recall that I told you if you wanted to use load balancers with any particular service, well, then you have to have the network interface card set to enable spoofing, so that also has to be enabled. But that's not all. We're not done yet. So under the operating system configuration, if you're going to allow load balancing, anyone? Well, yeah, you have to configure the features that will allow load balancing. So under features, we want to drag down to where it says network load balancing, and we also want to select the network load balancing tools. So I'm going to go ahead and select this, and then I'm going to scroll a little further down here, and I'm going to select the network load balancing tools. We're going to go ahead and click on OK. And let's go ahead and save and validate and see if those errors go away. Well, there you go. It is now clear. We have the connections that are properly made. This 3-tier service is now ready for the next phase, which is to configure a deployment for it. So we're going to go ahead and click on Configure Deployment. What would you like to call this? Let's call this PS4 for Pet Shop 4, T3 for 3-tier deployment. We're going to put it into our cloud. Let's go ahead and click on OK. And voila. So this gives you the final steps essentially for you to configure this environment. Well, if you had any global variables, they would show up here, except keep in mind the global variable at machine name at, well, that won't apply in a 3-tier environment because that would have to apply to all the VMs, which is why I showed you the name ##, which is a better way of applying a naming convention to multiple tiers. If you were just using a single tier, then the app machine name at or the at machine name at would work just fine. But because you're in a multi-tier environment, that wouldn't work very well, just simply because that would have to apply to all of them. Now we're not going to deploy this environment because it'll take forever to deploy this 3-tier environment, and I'm in a nested hypervisor environment, so it'll take a really long time. So let's go ahead and exit out of here. All right, what do you guys say we deploy something? We've been showing you all this stuff and saying, all right, we'll deploy it later. How about we actually deploy something? So what I've done to keep it a little simple is I've modified the web server here template. And if we go into the designer one more time, you'll see that I've added a load balancer to it, essentially very similar to what we did just earlier on. I made the same kind of configuration changes, all ready to go, properly connected, server connection going to the NIC for the server, client going to the VM network here. Everything is ready to go. I've saved and validated. I know that's all good. Let's go ahead and click a configuration deployment and name this, let's do web server 01. Actually, I've used that many times. Let's do web server 05 just to be on the safe side. We're deploying it into our cloud. We're going to go ahead and click on OK. And we have a problem. Houston, there's a problem. We have a red X here. Now, this is going to be a little difficult for you to remember, hence why I'm going to help you. When we originally built our cloud, we didn't enable load balancing capabilities on that cloud. And that's why you see this red X here. If you click on exit out and you click on delete and you come down here to jobs and you go through the jobs here and you take a look at this informational warning, it gives you all the information or all the hints that, hey, your cloud does not support load balancers. So if you come back up here into VMs and networks and you right click on your actual cloud, drag down to properties, under load balancers, look at that, it's not even enabled. So once you enable that, click on OK. Let's go back into the library and let's try to configure a deployment again. We're going to right click this time. Let's do it from here and let's do web server 05. We're going to go ahead and click on OK. So look at that. That's a thing of beauty. So everything looks good here. The deployment is ready to go. All we have to do now is click on deploy service. And you probably want to go play some Call of Duty, get a pop, do something, because this thing is going to take a little bit of time to complete. Yeah, don't let it fool you. That's 71%. It jumps to 71%. It takes forever. Usually gets to 99%, and then, you know, either it'll break there or something will happen. So don't let that fool you at all. Lo and behold, after all this time, that deployment was done. And you guys wanted me to deploy the 3-tier application? That would have taken forever on the equipment that I have. So once you have a successful deployment of a service, what I want you to do is click on VM and services here. Now traditionally you're used to looking at things from a VM's perspective. That's why the VMware view is always what's active typically in your window. Well, now that you are introduced to the notion of services, I need you to start looking at things from a services perspective. So I want you to change the view from VMs to services. Once you do that, you'll find that the service that we just deployed, and you'll find that you also have some options. We included a load balancer. We want this load balancer to be able to scale out this service whenever it needs to. So there's two ways of getting access to the scale out. You can either click on the button here, or if you select a tier, you'll find that you also have the option of clicking on it here. It'll give you the same type of wizard that gets initiated. Well, you have the tier that you are trying to scale out, and then you have the number of minimum and maximum amount of machines that you can scale out to. Now, I only have the defaults here, and I'll show you where you can go about before you deploy the service to specify if you want to be able to scale out further, more than one machine. That's actually a setting that I missed increasing here during deployment of that service, and it's really hard to go back and redeploy that because it takes such a long time, but I'll show you where it is so that you know where you can go and increase that number so that this doesn't change. Once you've selected the tier, you've selected, you know how many, you have a summary, a snapshot of what you can do from a scale out perspective. You can click on next. You have the ability of assigning a virtual machine name if you choose to do so. If you leave it blank, it's simply going to go through and assign it a generic name based on the naming convention that we put in place. So in our example, it would be web ##, so web 0 something, a number. When you're ready, you're going to click on next. If there's any configurations, typically this is applied through the template, but there's any configurations that you can change here. For instance, it'll be the name that's allowed, that is available to you. If you're good and ready with that, you're going to click on next. There's additional settings that you can do here, such as what do you want to do when the virtualization server starts. You can don't turn on the virtual machine. You have several options here of choosing, some sort of task. And you can also choose a task when the virtual machine stops. You can click on next. It gives you a summary, and then if you click on finish, it'll go through and it will deploy that additional VM resource in order to ease the load if a particular service is coming under significant amount of workload requirement. Let's go ahead and click on cancel. We're not actually going to deploy anything. Before I show you how you can remove a service, let me show you where you can go about increasing that maximum number that I was telling you about. So back here in the library, if we right click on this thing and go back down to Designer, and let's open it back up in Designer, if you click on it down here, you'll find that you have the ability of changing those minimums and maximums. So how many maximum instance numbers do you want me to be able to scale out to? So had I set this, for instance, up to 5, well, this would have changed the amount that I was getting in that scale out wizard when we went through it. So you just enable it in here and essentially go through those and scale it as much as you want or as little as you want. Now, from a deletion perspective, if you're trying to get rid of a particular service, let's go ahead and get out of here. We're not using this and go back into VMs and templates. Well, the deletion process is easy. Shut down the virtual machines, right-click, and delete. That is the way you would scale down a service, or you would remove a service altogether. One other thing that I wanted to show you in Designer, or one last thing that I want to show you in Designer, if we go back here into the library, I mentioned that there's several different ways by which you can create service templates. So for instance, if you right click on here and we create service template again, and this time let's go through and create this profile, and let's just call this for now T3 profile. Click on OK. You'll find that it automatically creates essentially these shells that you can then populate. Well, you can populate these shells any number of ways. You can, for example, let's take the web tier and simply drag it and drop it on here. Well, this will populate this particular tier. Well, if you didn't want to do the same thing here, what you can do here is you can double click on it, for example, and then you can go into the actual hardware configuration. Then you can click on New Disk, and then you can associate it with a disk. So you can click on Browse, and if you find a particular hard disk that you want, for instance, let's go with this, you can click on OK. And now you've created this hard disk that you're associating with this particular service. So there's a lot of different ways by which you can populate these shells that are being created. Then you can double click on it and add the application if you choose to do so, or you can again just drag and drop things onto the canvas here. So I wanted to make sure that you were aware that there's more than one way of doing servicing. It just depends on how you're comfortable and the method by which you're used to doing things. And that's all there is to it, folks. I hope you've enjoyed this long and interesting and interactive lesson. So what did we talk about? Well, we started off by talking about services, the importance of services, how and why we should be looking at services. We talked about how we can deploy a single tier service, and we did that. We did that with a load balancer, and I showed you how you can scale out. We talked about how you can delete a service, how you can scale back if you've had too many deployments and you want to scale down, essentially. I showed you how you can do that. We also talked about the deployment of a 3-tier application and all the dependencies that you have on that. We didn't deploy it, but I showed you how to kind of put it together. We also talked significantly about the fact that there's a lot of different ways of configuring this particular environment. There's a lot of different ways of designing your services and your templates. You can drag and drop. You can use some pre-existing profiles that will set the tiers up for you. You can use VM templates, or you can try to put everything together at the time of provisioning. So there's a lot of different ways of creating that automation and orchestration within your environment. It just depends on what you are comfortable with. Finally, I hope this lesson was very informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.